If a queen can be discarded this easily, then perhaps no crown is worth wearing. Claire Anderson whispered to herself as the echo of the Alpha King's voice rolled across the great hall. Hundreds of nobles stood beneath towering marble columns draped with silver banners bearing the crest of the Northern Wolf Kingdom, yet not a single person stepped forward on her behalf. The silence felt heavier than the jeweled crown resting upon her head. It was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of people who had already decided she had lost. Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward the royal throne where Alpha King Nathaniel Brooks sat with calm authority, his expression unreadable beneath the golden light pouring through stained glass windows. For 3 years she had stood faithfully beside him through every council meeting, every royal ceremony, every winter festival, and every difficult season that tested the kingdom. She had never demanded praise. She had never sought attention. She had believed that quiet loyalty would eventually earn understanding. Instead, it had earned only whispers. To the nobles lining both sides of the hall, she was the useless queen who possessed neither extraordinary strength nor legendary bloodline. They saw no dazzling power surrounding her, no dramatic display of ancient magic, and no political influence capable of strengthening the throne. They judged her by everything she appeared not to be, never noticing the countless small burdens she quietly carried each day. She remembered comforting frightened children after storms swept through nearby villages, visiting wounded soldiers returning from border patrols, organizing food deliveries during harsh winters, and spending long evenings listening to widows who believed the palace had forgotten them. None of those moments had ever become royal headlines. Kindness rarely did. Today, none of it seemed to matter. A royal advisor stepped forward, carefully unfolding an official document bearing the kingdom's seal. His voice echoed clearly across the enormous chamber. By the judgment of His Majesty, the current royal marriage shall come to an end in the interest of the kingdom's future prosperity. A quiet murmur spread through the gathered court. Some nobles nodded with visible approval. Others exchanged cautious glances but remained silent. Claire looked at Nathaniel, searching his face for even the smallest sign that this decision caused him pain. She found only composure. It was not cruelty that hurt her most. It was distance. Somewhere along the way, the man she had promised to support had stopped seeing the woman standing before him and had begun seeing only a political disappointment. Nathaniel finally rose from the throne. His deep voice carried effortlessly through the hall. The kingdom requires a queen capable of securing alliances stronger than sympathy alone. Every word landed with measured precision. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. Somehow that certainty hurt more than rage ever could. Claire lowered her gaze for a brief moment, allowing herself one quiet breath before looking back at him. She refused to cry in front of a court already waiting to witness her humiliation. Her mother had once told her that true dignity revealed itself most clearly when everything else had been taken away. She intended to honor those words. Slowly, she lifted both hands to the delicate silver crown resting upon her head. The diamonds caught the afternoon sunlight as she carefully removed it. No trembling, no dramatic gesture, only calm acceptance. She walked several measured steps across the polished marble floor until she reached the foot of the royal staircase. Every sound disappeared except the soft echo of her footsteps. Without speaking, she placed the crown upon the highest step leading toward the throne. The simple movement carried more grace than any speech could have expressed. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. Claire bowed respectfully, not because she accepted their judgment, but because she refused to abandon her own character. When she finally turned toward the enormous palace doors, no royal guard stopped her. No court official offered farewell. She walked alone through the center of the great hall while hundreds silently watched the queen they had underestimated leave without bitterness, accusation, or revenge. Just before the towering doors opened, a cool breeze swept into the chamber from outside, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and something unfamiliar lingering far beyond the distant mountains. Claire paused for only a heartbeat, as though sensing that the world beyond the palace walls was already beginning to change. Behind her, the treaty banners hanging above the throne fluttered unexpectedly despite the still air inside the hall, and somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen by everyone gathered in the kingdom, An ancient presence slowly turned its eyes toward the woman who had just walked away from her crown. The heavy palace doors closed behind Claire Anderson with a deep echo that lingered across the stone courtyard long after she had stepped beyond them, and for the first time in 3 years no royal attendant walked beside her. No ceremonial carriage waited at the bottom of the marble stairs, and no banner bearing the Queen's crest followed in the breeze. Gray clouds drifted across the afternoon sky, while a cool wind carried the scent of pine forests from the northern mountains. Claire paused only long enough to remove the jeweled clasp that fastened the royal cape around her shoulders. She folded the garment carefully and placed it upon the nearest stone bench, leaving behind the final symbol of a title that no longer belonged to her. The simple blue dress beneath the ceremonial robes suddenly felt lighter than any royal gown she had ever worn. She began walking toward the capital's eastern gate without looking back, her footsteps steady despite the curious eyes following her from palace balconies and nearby streets. News traveled through the city faster than any rider. Shopkeepers lowered their voices as she passed. Families standing outside bakeries exchanged uncertain glances. Children who once waved excitedly to their queen now watched quietly, confused by the respectful silence surrounding the woman they still recognized. Claire offered each of them the same gentle smile she had always given, unwilling to allow disappointment to erase the kindness that had shaped her long before she entered the palace. At the castle, the great hall gradually emptied, yet the uneasy feeling remained. Several council members congratulated one another for what they believed was a wise political decision, speaking confidently about stronger alliances, greater influence, and a brighter future for the kingdom. Nathaniel Brooks listened without interruption from the royal throne, but their words seemed strangely distant. His gaze rested upon the empty staircase where Claire had placed the crown only minutes earlier. The polished silver still reflected the afternoon sunlight, untouched by anyone in the room. A senior advisor finally approached with cautious confidence. "Your Majesty, preparations for future negotiations may now begin immediately." Nathaniel answered after a long silence. "Leave the crown where it is." The advisor blinked with surprise, but bowed respectfully. No one questioned the order. Meanwhile, Claire continued beyond the crowded marketplace until the grand buildings of the capital slowly gave way to quiet streets lined with maple trees and modest cottages. Every familiar landmark reminded her of moments the court had never noticed. She remembered delivering blankets during the coldest winter in decades, planting gardens beside the local schoolhouse, and spending evenings reading stories to children whose parents worked late into the night. None of those memories belonged to the palace. They belonged to the people. As she reached the old stone bridge crossing the Silver Creek, an elderly woman carrying a basket of apples suddenly recognized her. "Your Majesty," the woman whispered instinctively before catching herself. Claire smiled warmly and shook her head. "Just Claire is enough." The woman hesitated before placing a bright red apple into Claire's hand. "Kindness does not disappear because someone changes your title." Claire thanked her softly, holding the fruit as though it were more valuable than the jewels she had left behind. The brief exchange warmed her heart more than any royal ceremony ever had. Far above the kingdom, hidden behind layers of drifting clouds, enormous shadows crossed the sky with silent precision. No ordinary birds could cast silhouettes that vast. Shepherds tending their flocks on distant hills looked upward with puzzled expressions before the shapes disappeared behind another bank of clouds. Travelers along the northern road spoke quietly about hearing unfamiliar cries carried by the wind, deep and ancient, like echoes from forgotten legends. Within the palace walls, none of those distant signs reached the council chamber. Discussions continued around maps, treaties, and calculations of influence. Nathaniel remained unusually quiet throughout every conversation. Whenever another noble praised the day's decision, he found himself remembering Claire's final bow. There had been no resentment in her eyes, no desperate plea, only quiet dignity. For reasons he could not explain, that memory refused to leave him. As evening approached, rain finally began falling across the capital in a gentle, steady rhythm. Claire found shelter beneath the wooden roof of a small roadside chapel overlooking the valley. She sat alone on the front steps, listening to raindrops strike the stone path while the apple rested in her hands. She had entered the palace years earlier believing that loyalty would always be enough. Today she understood that loyalty without recognition could quietly become loneliness. Yet even now she felt no desire for revenge. She simply wished to discover who she was beyond the expectations of a kingdom that had never truly known her. As twilight settled across the mountains, a single beam of crimson light briefly pierced the dark clouds far to the east before disappearing again. Claire looked toward the distant horizon without understanding why her heart suddenly stirred with quiet familiarity, while many miles away beyond forests, rivers, and ancient peaks, a procession unlike anything the Northern Wolf Kingdom had witnessed in generations had already begun its journey westward, carrying a destiny that would soon transform the fate of every crown beneath the sky. Night settled gently across the valley as Claire Anderson remained beneath the small chapel overlooking the winding road leading east. The steady rain had faded into a cool mist that drifted between the towering pine trees, leaving countless droplets shimmering beneath the moonlight. She had expected to feel empty after losing everything that had defined her public life. Yet what surprised her most was the strange sense of peace growing quietly within her heart. For the first time in years, no royal schedule dictated where she should stand, no political advisor instructed her what to say, and no court expected her to smile while hiding disappointment. She listened to the soft chorus of crickets and distant streams, discovering that the silence beyond the palace walls felt kinder than the applause she had often received inside them. At sunrise, she continued along the old eastern highway, carrying nothing except a small travel bag, the bright red apple given to her by the elderly woman, and the quiet determination to begin again without resentment. Farmers preparing their fields greeted her with polite smiles, unaware that the traveler passing beside them had once worn the kingdom's crown. Claire gladly accepted directions toward the nearest village where she hoped to find temporary work and a modest place to stay. She never introduced herself by her former title. She simply thanked everyone she met with the same warmth that had always come naturally to her. Several miles away, the atmosphere inside the royal palace felt unusually tense despite the official celebrations taking place throughout the capital. Noble families congratulated one another over elegant breakfasts, speaking confidently about the promising alliances they believed would soon strengthen the Northern Wolf Kingdom. Nathaniel Brooks attended every meeting expected of a king, answering questions with calm precision, yet his thoughts repeatedly wandered toward the empty road leading away from the city. During the morning council session, an advisor enthusiastically presented a list of influential noblewomen considered suitable candidates for a future royal marriage. Nathaniel listened patiently before closing the document without reading beyond the first page. "There is no urgency," he said quietly. The council members exchanged puzzled glances. Only yesterday they had celebrated the conclusion of one royal chapter, yet their king seemed strangely unwilling to begin another. None of them understood why the memory of Claire's composed farewell continued to linger in the room long after she had disappeared beyond the palace gates. Far beyond the northern forests, across mountain ranges that few travelers had ever crossed, another kingdom had already received unexpected news. Inside a magnificent palace carved into cliffs overlooking crimson lakes, ancient banners bearing the emblem of the Dragon Empire stirred gently beneath warm mountain winds. Courtiers stood respectfully in perfect silence as a royal messenger knelt before the Dragon Emperor. The messenger presented a sealed letter delivered through trusted diplomatic channels only hours earlier. The emperor accepted the document without speaking. His expression remained calm, while his golden eyes slowly scanned every line written upon the parchment. Around him, experienced ministers watched carefully, recognizing that the atmosphere had changed before a single word had been spoken. When the emperor finally lowered the letter, disappointment rather than anger settled across his face. He folded the parchment with remarkable care, as though refusing to allow even the paper itself to suffer from another ruler's poor judgment. "Prepare my personal escort," he instructed in a steady voice that carried effortlessly across the great chamber. "We leave immediately." None of the ministers questioned the order. They had served their emperor long enough to recognize that when he chose to travel personally instead of sending ambassadors, the matter involved far more than diplomacy. Across the enormous palace, attendants moved with quiet efficiency as ceremonial armor was polished, travel banners unfurled, and magnificent dragons were prepared for a journey that would cross hundreds of miles before reaching the northern wolf kingdom. Outside the capital, Claire reached a peaceful village resting beside a crystal-clear river shortly before noon. A local baker noticed the tired traveler and offered her a warm loaf of fresh bread in exchange for helping arrange supplies before the afternoon customers arrived. Claire accepted with genuine gratitude, working carefully beside the cheerful family throughout the day. She swept flour from the wooden floor, organized baskets of fruit, greeted visitors with sincere kindness, and laughed softly when small children proudly displayed their freshly baked rolls. No one knew they were speaking with a former queen, yet everyone treated her with simple respect because of the gentle person standing before them rather than the title she no longer carried. As evening approached, Claire stepped outside the bakery and looked toward the western horizon where the fading sunlight painted the clouds with brilliant shades of gold and crimson. At that exact moment, a deep, majestic call echoed across the distant mountains. It was neither thunder nor any sound the villagers had heard before. People slowly emerged from their homes, shielding their eyes as enormous silhouettes appeared high above the clouds. They moved with graceful confidence across the glowing sky, their broad wings catching the final rays of daylight until the heavens themselves seemed painted in living fire. Claire stood completely still, unable to explain why the unfamiliar sight stirred memories she could not fully remember, while somewhere beyond those brilliant clouds a royal procession continued its steady approach, carrying not only the authority of an empire, but also a truth that would soon change the destiny of kingdoms and reveal that the woman who believed she had lost everything had never truly been alone. The entire village stood frozen beneath the glowing evening sky as the immense shapes above the clouds drifted steadily closer, their graceful wings reflecting streaks of crimson and gold across the fading daylight. No one spoke for several long moments because no one could remember ever witnessing such a breathtaking sight. The oldest residents quietly exchanged uncertain looks, recalling stories their grandparents had once told about dragons that had not been seen for generations. Claire Anderson watched alongside the villagers, her heart beating a little faster with every passing second. She could not explain why the distant silhouettes felt strangely familiar, as though they belonged to a memory resting just beyond her reach. The gentle baker stepped beside her and whispered, "Whatever is coming, I do not think it has come for ordinary travelers." Claire smiled politely, although she sensed the same quiet certainty. By the following morning, word had spread throughout every town and village across the northern wolf kingdom. Merchants arriving from distant roads spoke of magnificent dragons flying high above the eastern mountains. Border scouts reported a royal procession unlike anything they had ever witnessed. Yet the reports carried no warnings of invasion, no signs of panic, and no indication of hostile intentions. Instead, every messenger repeated the same astonishing detail. The banners carried beneath those enormous wings belonged to the Dragon Empire itself. Inside the royal palace, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Nathaniel Brooks listened carefully as the captain of the royal guard delivered the newest intelligence before the assembled council. "Your Majesty, the Dragon Emperor is approaching our kingdom with a formal imperial escort. Their pace suggests they intend to arrive before sunset." A wave of surprise swept across the chamber. Several advisors quickly began discussing possible diplomatic reasons behind such an extraordinary visit. One noble confidently suggested that the Dragon Empire wished to negotiate new trade routes. Another believed they intended to strengthen military cooperation. Nathaniel remained silent. Something about the timing unsettled him. The Dragon Empire rarely involved itself in the affairs of neighboring kingdoms without significant reason. For an emperor to travel personally rather than dispatch ambassadors was almost unheard of. As preparations for the royal reception began throughout the palace, servants polished marble floors until they reflected the towering chandeliers overhead. Musicians rehearsed ceremonial pieces while chefs prepared elaborate banquets worthy of welcoming one of the most respected rulers in the known world. Every detail received careful attention because everyone understood that the Dragon Emperor commanded extraordinary influence far beyond his own borders. Even kingdoms separated by vast oceans respected his wisdom and restraint. Meanwhile, Claire spent the morning helping the baker deliver fresh bread throughout the village. She accepted simple gratitude with genuine warmth, never mentioning the life she had left behind. An elderly schoolteacher invited her to share breakfast after noticing the kindness she showed every person she met. During the meal, the teacher smiled gently and said, "Titles can open doors, but character opens hearts. You seem to understand the difference." Claire lowered her eyes for a moment before quietly answering, "I am only beginning to understand it myself." The words surprised even her because they felt completely true. She no longer wished to define herself by a throne that had never truly accepted her. Instead, she wanted to become someone whose worth could never again be measured by a crown. Shortly after noon, the peaceful rhythm of the village changed. Children playing near the river pointed excitedly toward the eastern horizon. The dragons were no longer distant shadows hidden among clouds. They now flew clearly across the brilliant blue sky, majestic and unhurried, their broad wings creating graceful patterns against the sunlight. At their center flew the largest dragon anyone had ever seen, its scales gleaming like polished bronze touched by dawn itself. Beneath it fluttered a royal banner embroidered with an elegant golden dragon encircled by stars. Villagers gathered in respectful silence as the magnificent procession continued westward toward the capital without descending. Claire instinctively placed one hand over her heart as a gentle breeze passed around her, carrying a faint warmth unlike anything she had ever felt. High above, the lead dragon briefly tilted its enormous head downward, as though acknowledging someone standing below before continuing its steady journey. Claire watched until the procession disappeared beyond distant hills, unaware that the brief moment had not gone unnoticed. A distinguished man standing upon the balcony of an ornate carriage suspended beneath the lead dragon lowered his gaze thoughtfully after seeing the young woman beside the village road. His silver robes stirred softly in the wind while a trusted advisor stepped beside him. "Your Majesty," the advisor said respectfully, "we will reach the Northern Wolf capital within the hour." The Dragon Emperor continued looking toward the fading horizon where Claire had disappeared from sight. A calm smile, touched with unmistakable relief, slowly appeared upon his face. "Good," he replied in a quiet voice filled with certainty. "She is safe." The advisor seemed surprised by the unexpected response, but asked no further questions. As the royal procession advanced toward the towering walls of the Northern Wolf Kingdom, every bell within the capital began ringing to announce the arrival of the Empire's honored guest. Nathaniel walked alone toward the palace entrance to welcome the Dragon Emperor with full royal ceremony, believing he was about to receive an important diplomatic visitor. He had no way of knowing that the true purpose of the Emperor's journey had never been trade, alliances, or politics. It had always been one woman who no longer wore a crown, but whose value had never depended upon one. Golden banners swayed gently above the palace gates as the royal reception assembled with flawless precision, yet beneath the polished ceremony, an uneasy tension settled over every noble gathered in the courtyard. Nathaniel Brooks descended the grand staircase dressed in formal royal attire, surrounded by ministers, advisors, and the captains of the royal guard. Every eye turned toward the eastern sky as the magnificent dragon procession slowly approached the capital. The dragons did not circle dramatically or display overwhelming force. Instead, they glided with calm confidence, each measured movement reflecting discipline earned through generations of honor. As the lead dragon descended beyond the palace walls, the wind carried a warm current through the courtyard, causing the kingdom's banners to flutter beside the golden standard of the Dragon Empire. Moments later, the Dragon Emperor stepped forward from the ceremonial platform with quiet dignity. He wore no excessive jewels and carried no visible weapon. His presence alone commanded complete respect. Nathaniel advanced several steps before offering the formal greeting reserved for visiting monarchs. "Your Majesty, the Northern Wolf Kingdom welcomes you with gratitude and friendship. May your journey have been peaceful." The Dragon Emperor acknowledged the greeting with a courteous nod. "The journey was comfortable. Thank you for receiving us." His voice remained calm, yet his golden eyes carefully studied the faces gathered before him, as though searching for someone who was no longer there. The palace musicians completed the welcoming anthem before servants presented refreshments according to royal custom. Nobles expected discussions regarding commerce, diplomacy, or regional stability. Instead, after only a few moments of polite conversation, the Dragon Emperor asked a single unexpected question. "Where is Queen Claire Anderson?" The courtyard fell completely silent. Several ministers exchanged uncertain glances before looking toward Nathaniel. The Alpha King answered with composed confidence. "Claire no longer serves as queen. The marriage was dissolved through lawful royal judgment." The Dragon Emperor remained still for several long seconds. He neither interrupted nor displayed visible anger. He simply regarded Nathaniel with thoughtful disappointment, as though carefully weighing words before speaking again. "I see," he replied quietly. "Then perhaps I have arrived at precisely the right moment." Those standing nearby sensed the subtle change in the atmosphere, even though the emperor had not raised his voice. Experienced diplomats recognized that his calmness carried greater weight than open frustration ever could. Nathaniel invited the emperor into the Grand Council chamber where maps, official documents, and ceremonial records had already been arranged for the anticipated negotiations. Ministers eagerly prepared to discuss trade routes and future alliances, believing the conversation would soon return to familiar political matters. Instead, once everyone had taken their seats, the Dragon Emperor gently placed a beautifully crafted wooden case upon the polished conference table. He opened it with deliberate care, revealing an aged parchment protected beneath crystal-clear glass. The parchment bore an ancient imperial seal recognized by every historian in the room. Several elderly advisors immediately stood in astonishment upon recognizing the document's significance. It was an original covenant created decades earlier between the Dragon Empire and the Northern Wolf Kingdom, long before Nathaniel had become king. The Dragon Emperor rested one hand lightly upon the case before speaking. Many years ago, this agreement was established upon trust rather than convenience. It promised that both kingdoms would honor not only each other's borders, but also each other's families. Nathaniel listened attentively, uncertain where the conversation was leading. The emperor continued in the same composed tone. "Some promises survive because they are written upon parchment. Greater promises survive because they are written upon the hearts of honorable people." Meanwhile, miles away in the peaceful riverside village, Claire finished helping the baker prepare the final trays for the evening customers. She smiled warmly as children thanked her for wrapping fresh pastries with remarkable patience. Although she remained unaware of the conversations unfolding inside the palace, she felt an unexpected sense of calm unlike anything she had experienced during her years as queen. For the first time in a very long while, she did not feel judged by expectations she could never satisfy. Instead, she simply felt useful. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the gentle river, the elderly schoolteacher approached once more carrying a neatly folded traveling cloak. "The evenings become cool here," the teacher said kindly. "Please accept this." Claire hesitated before gratefully accepting the thoughtful gift. The simple gesture touched her far more deeply than expensive royal treasures ever had. Back inside the council chamber, the Dragon Emperor slowly closed the wooden case before looking directly at Nathaniel. "Before we discuss the future of our kingdoms, there is one matter that must first be resolved." Every noble leaned forward in anticipation. The emperor's expression remained composed, yet his next words carried unmistakable certainty. "I did not cross mountains, rivers, and borders to negotiate over land or wealth. I came because someone under my protection was sent away without understanding her true worth." The room became so quiet that the crackling fireplace could be heard from across the chamber. Nathaniel's calm expression shifted almost imperceptibly as realization began to stir within him. While outside the palace windows, the Golden Dragon Empire banners continued moving gently in the evening breeze, as though history itself had quietly arrived to ask a kingdom whether it truly understood the value of the woman it had chosen to let go. No one inside the Grand Council chamber moved after the Dragon Emperor finished speaking. The silence that followed carried more weight than any formal declaration ever could. Every minister looked from the ancient covenant resting upon the polished table to Alpha King Nathaniel Brooks, waiting for someone to break the stillness. Nathaniel remained composed, but a question he had never considered before quietly settled into his thoughts. Why would the Dragon Emperor cross hundreds of miles for a woman the Northern Wolf Kingdom had dismissed as insignificant? The Dragon Emperor folded his hands calmly before him, and continued in the same measured voice. A kingdom may replace a title. It may appoint another queen. It may even rewrite its records. But wisdom cannot be rewritten so easily. Several elderly advisors lowered their eyes, sensing that the conversation had moved far beyond politics. One senior historian finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Your Majesty, forgive my question, but may we ask why Queen Claire is so important to the Dragon Empire?" The Dragon Emperor regarded the old scholar with quiet respect before answering. "Because some people carry value long before the world recognizes it. The greatest mistake a ruler can make is believing that worth exists only where power is visible." His words settled heavily across the chamber. Nathaniel remembered countless council meetings during which Claire had spoken gently on behalf of farmers, teachers, healers, and ordinary families. At the time, he had dismissed many of those suggestions as compassionate, but politically unimportant. Yet several of those very policies had quietly strengthened the kingdom over the past 3 years. Food shortages had decreased after her village supply program. Border communities had become more loyal after her regular visits. Charitable schools she encouraged now educated children from families who had once distrusted the crown. None of those achievements had required extraordinary magic. They had required patience, kindness, and consistency. For the first time, Nathaniel wondered how many victories had quietly belonged to the woman he had never truly acknowledged. Across the kingdom, Claire Anderson spent the afternoon helping the village schoolteacher organize books inside a small classroom overlooking the river. The children laughed as she carefully repaired worn pages with simple paste and fresh paper. One little girl looked up at Claire with bright curiosity and asked, "Have you always been this good at helping people?" Claire smiled softly before answering, "I have simply been fortunate enough to learn from kind people." The teacher watched the exchange with gentle admiration. Later, after the children returned home, the teacher quietly said, "You speak as though you once carried a heavy responsibility." Claire looked through the classroom window toward the distant mountains glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. "I did," she answered honestly. "I only wish I had understood sooner that responsibility means very little if people only notice the crown and never the person wearing it." The teacher nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the right place finds us only after the wrong place lets us go." Those simple words lingered in Claire's heart long after the conversation ended. Back at the palace, the Dragon Emperor slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the enormous windows overlooking the capital. Citizens continued their daily routines below, unaware that a conversation capable of changing the future of 2 kingdoms was unfolding above them. Without turning around, the Emperor spoke quietly. "Tell me, Alpha King, when was the last time you asked your queen what made her happy?" Nathaniel did not answer immediately because he realized he could not remember. The Emperor asked another question. "When was the last time you thanked her for serving beside you?" Again, silence answered. The room itself seemed to acknowledge what words could not. Nathaniel finally spoke in a voice noticeably quieter than before. "I believed I was making the best decision for my kingdom." The Dragon Emperor slowly faced him once more. "Perhaps you were trying to protect your kingdom. But protecting a kingdom and understanding the people who protect it are not always the same thing." No accusation filled his voice, only quiet disappointment. Somehow that disappointed kindness proved far more difficult to face than anger would have been. As evening approached, a royal attendant entered the chamber carrying a sealed report from Eastern Border Scouts. The messenger bowed respectfully before reading aloud. "Your Majesty, local villages report that the former queen was welcomed with gratitude wherever she traveled. Citizens describe her as generous, humble, and eager to help despite possessing no royal escort or personal wealth." Several ministers shifted uncomfortably. They had expected stories of bitterness or resentment. Instead, every report described compassion. Nathaniel accepted the written document and slowly read each witness statement for himself. Every page revealed another quiet act of service. Every account reflected the same unwavering character Claire had displayed inside the palace. Only now he was seeing it through the eyes of people who expected nothing from her except kindness. The Dragon Emperor watched Nathaniel carefully before speaking one final sentence that evening. "A person's true character becomes easiest to see after every privilege has been taken away." Nathaniel lowered the report without speaking. Beyond the palace windows, The last light of day disappeared behind the mountains while the ancient covenant remained resting upon the council table, untouched, yet somehow more significant than before, waiting for a decision that would determine not merely the future of an alliance, but whether one king possessed the humility to recognize the extraordinary value he had only begun to understand after she was already gone. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows of the Grand Council chamber, casting long bands of golden light across the ancient covenant that remained untouched upon the polished table. No one had dared move it overnight. The Dragon Emperor stood quietly beside the window, overlooking the awakening capital, while Nathaniel Brooks entered the chamber after a restless night that had offered little sleep and even fewer answers. For the first time since ascending the throne, he found himself questioning not his authority, but his judgment. Every memory of Claire Anderson returned with surprising clarity. He remembered how she greeted palace servants by name, how she stayed behind after royal banquets to thank the kitchen staff, how she insisted that village reports be read before discussions about festivals and celebrations. At the time, he had believed those gestures reflected kindness alone. Now he wondered whether they had reflected a kind of wisdom he had failed to recognize. Without turning away from the window, the Dragon Emperor spoke gently. The strongest rulers are not remembered because they never made mistakes. They are remembered because they possessed the humility to recognize them. Nathaniel remained silent before finally asking the question that had troubled him throughout the night. Who is Claire to you? The Dragon Emperor slowly turned to face him, his expression calm and thoughtful. She is someone my empire has cherished from the day she entered this world. Long before she became your queen, she carried responsibilities that neither crowns nor titles could define. We allowed her to choose her own path because we believed true character grows through freedom, not privilege. She wished to build a life through kindness rather than inheritance. We respected that choice. The ministers listened in complete silence, realizing they had understood almost nothing about the woman they had judged so confidently. Nathaniel lowered his eyes as another memory surfaced. Claire had never once used influence to demand special treatment. She had never spoken of powerful relatives, hidden alliances, or noble lineage beyond what the court already knew. She had deliberately lived with quiet humility. The realization settled heavily upon him. She had not hidden weakness. She had hidden greatness. Several hundred miles away, Claire continued helping the villagers prepare for the annual harvest gathering. Together, they decorated the small town square with fresh flowers, colorful ribbons, and handmade lanterns that would illuminate the evening celebration. Children eagerly invited her to join their games, while local musicians practiced cheerful songs beneath the old oak trees. Watching their simple happiness, Claire found herself smiling more often than she had in many months. The heavy burden she had carried inside the palace seemed to grow lighter with every passing day. She no longer measured her worth by royal approval. Instead, she discovered quiet satisfaction in making ordinary lives a little brighter. As preparations continued, the elderly schoolteacher approached carrying a neatly wrapped wooden box. "This belonged to my late husband," the teacher explained warmly. "He always believed that people should receive gifts because they are appreciated, not because they hold important positions." Claire carefully opened the box and found a beautifully carved compass resting inside. Tears gently filled her eyes as she accepted the thoughtful gift. "I will treasure it," she whispered sincerely. "Then it has found the right owner," the teacher replied with a smile. Back inside the palace, a royal messenger entered the council chamber carrying fresh correspondence gathered from towns across the kingdom. Every report described the same remarkable pattern. Wherever Claire had traveled, she had quietly offered assistance without revealing her former identity. She had helped repair fences, comfort frightened children, organize food supplies, and encourage struggling families. No witness reported bitterness. No one described anger. Every account spoke only of compassion. Nathaniel slowly folded the final letter after reading its closing sentence. She asked for nothing except the opportunity to help. Those simple words echoed through his thoughts. The Dragon Emperor observed him carefully before walking toward the ancient covenant resting upon the table. With measured hands, he lifted the document from its protective case. Every noble watched closely, sensing that an important decision had finally arrived. The emperor looked across the chamber before speaking with calm authority. This agreement was created to unite two kingdoms built upon honor and mutual respect. Such agreements survive only while those values remain alive. He gently rolled the parchment closed, but did not yet hand it back to its attendants. Instead, he turned toward Nathaniel one final time. I will not ask you whether Claire deserves your respect. Her actions have already answered that question. The only question remaining is whether your kingdom deserves hers. The words settled across the chamber with quiet finality. No one attempted to respond because every person present understood the truth contained within them. Outside the palace walls, church bells rang softly as another peaceful afternoon unfolded across the capital. While far away, Claire stood beside the village children releasing small paper lanterns into the bright blue sky, unaware that her kindness had become the measure by which an entire kingdom was now being judged, and that the decision awaiting the Dragon Emperor would soon reshape the future of both realms in a way no council, no treaty, and no crown could ever have predicted. The afternoon sun hung low above the peaceful valley as the annual harvest celebration filled the village with quiet laughter, music, and the comforting aroma of fresh bread drifting through the cool autumn air. Claire Anderson moved among the families with effortless warmth, helping children hang colorful ribbons between the old maple trees while neighbors arranged long wooden tables covered with homemade meals. No one treated her as royalty. No one bowed when she passed. Yet every smile offered to her carried a sincerity she had rarely experienced inside the palace. She found herself laughing freely when a little boy proudly presented a hand-carved wooden bird he had made himself, insisting that she keep it because, in his words, "You always make everyone feel safe." Claire accepted the small gift with grateful eyes, realizing that genuine appreciation often arrived in the simplest forms. As evening approached, musicians began playing gentle melodies while paper lanterns illuminated the village square with warm golden light. The elderly schoolteacher quietly joined Claire near the riverbank and observed the celebration with a peaceful smile. "You have only been here a few days," the teacher said softly. "Yet it already feels as though you have belonged here for years." Claire looked across the gathering where neighbors welcomed one another without concern for titles or status. "Perhaps belonging has less to do with where we are accepted," she answered thoughtfully, "and more to do with where we are free to be ourselves." The teacher nodded with quiet understanding. At that same moment, far away inside the Northern Wolf Palace, the atmosphere had become noticeably heavier than during the Dragon Emperor's arrival. Ministers gathered once again around the Grand Council table, aware that the future of their kingdom rested upon the decision now unfolding before them. Nathaniel Brooks stood silently beside the ancient covenant while the Dragon Emperor regarded the room with calm authority. No anger appeared upon his face. There was only profound disappointment that seemed to reach every person present. The Emperor carefully unrolled the historic agreement one final time. Every seal, every signature, and every promise reflected decades of trust established between two honorable kingdoms. He allowed the assembled nobles a long moment to study the document before speaking. "Treaties are not merely agreements between rulers," he said evenly. "They are promises that the values of both kingdoms will remain worthy of one another." Several ministers lowered their heads, unable to meet his gaze. Nathaniel stepped forward at last, his voice quieter than it had been in many years. "I failed to see what stood beside me every day. I judged with my eyes instead of my heart. If I have wronged Claire, then I accept that responsibility." The Dragon Emperor acknowledged the admission with a slight nod. Recognizing failure is the first step toward wisdom. It is not the final one. The chamber remained completely silent. Then, with slow and deliberate movement, the Dragon Emperor lifted the ancient covenant in both hands. Every noble watched with complete attention as he looked once more toward Nathaniel. This alliance was founded upon mutual honor. Honor cannot survive where a person's dignity is so easily discarded. Without haste and without anger, he separated the old parchment into two pieces along its natural fold. The soft sound of ancient paper giving way echoed through the chamber with astonishing clarity. No one dared interrupt. The Emperor carefully placed the divided document upon the council table. "From this moment forward," he declared calmly, "this covenant no longer binds our kingdoms. Respect cannot be preserved by ink after it has already been forgotten in action." The room fell into stunned silence. Nathaniel stared at the separated parchment, fully understanding that what had just ended was not simply a political agreement, but decades of trust earned by generations before him. Yet he also understood that the emperor had not acted out of vengeance. Every word, every gesture, and every decision had reflected principle rather than resentment. Across the village, unaware of the historic moment unfolding inside the palace, Claire released a small paper lantern into the evening sky beside dozens of laughing children. The tiny light floated upward until it joined countless others drifting peacefully above the rooftops. She watched them disappear among the stars and quietly closed her eyes for a brief moment. The weight she had carried since leaving the palace seemed lighter than ever before. She did not know that an empire had just chosen principle over diplomacy because of the respect it held for her character. She only knew that, for the first time in many years, she felt hopeful about tomorrow. Back inside the council chamber, the Dragon Emperor gently returned the separated covenant to its wooden case before closing the lid with great care. He then looked directly at Nathaniel one final time. A kingdom may rebuild walls, restore alliances, and negotiate new agreements, he said quietly. But trust must always be earned again. Nathaniel lowered his head, not before a more powerful ruler, but before the truth he could no longer deny. As twilight settled across both kingdoms, the divided covenant rested silently upon the polished table, while, many miles away beneath a sky filled with softly glowing lanterns, the woman once called a useless queen smiled, without knowing that her quiet dignity had accomplished what power alone never could, changing the course of history simply by remaining faithful to the goodness that no crown had ever created and no throne had ever truly deserved. The first light of dawn spread gently across the northern wolf kingdom, bathing the palace towers in soft shades of gold, while a quiet stillness settled over the royal capital unlike any morning before. Nathaniel Brooks stood alone on the highest balcony overlooking the city that had trusted him to lead with wisdom. Below, merchants opened their shops, children hurried through narrow streets, and families greeted another day with simple hope, unaware that their king had spent the entire night reflecting upon the woman whose quiet kindness had strengthened their lives far more than they had ever realized. The divided covenant remained upon the council table behind him, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a reminder that every decision carried consequences extending far beyond a throne. Nathaniel closed his eyes and remembered the countless moments he had once overlooked. He remembered Claire Anderson patiently listening to elderly citizens after long council meetings had already ended. He remembered finding fresh flowers placed beside memorials for soldiers who never returned home, only now realizing that Claire had quietly arranged them every month without asking anyone to notice. He remembered the warmth she brought into rooms burdened by political arguments and the calm reassurance she offered whenever fear spread through the kingdom. None of those memories reflected weakness. They reflected a strength he had never learned to measure. Inside the palace, the Dragon Emperor prepared to begin the journey home. His attendants carefully secured the wooden case containing the divided covenant before loading it onto the ceremonial carriage. As the final preparations were completed, Nathaniel entered the courtyard and respectfully approached the emperor. There was no pride left in his voice, only honesty. "I cannot change what has already happened," he said quietly. "But I understand now that I judged Claire by what I expected her to become instead of appreciating who she had always been." The Dragon Emperor regarded him with calm understanding. "Wisdom often arrives after regret," he replied. "The question every ruler must answer is whether that wisdom changes the person who carries the crown." Nathaniel nodded slowly. He knew no apology spoken within palace walls could erase the loneliness Claire had endured. Even so, he silently promised himself that the lessons she had left behind would shape every decision he made from that day forward. Many miles away, Claire stood beside the peaceful river where children skipped smooth stones across the water while the baker prepared fresh bread for the morning customers. The elderly schoolteacher approached carrying a neatly folded letter that had arrived from a passing traveler earlier that morning. Claire accepted it with quiet curiosity before discovering that it contained no royal command, no request to return, and no political message. Instead, it came from one of the palace servants who had worked beside her for years. The servant simply wished to thank her for every act of kindness she had shown the staff, writing that the palace already felt colder without her gentle presence. Claire smiled softly as she folded the letter and placed it carefully inside the wooden box that also held the carved compass and the small wooden bird given to her by the village children. Those simple gifts meant more to her than the royal jewels she had once worn because they had been offered freely by people who valued her heart rather than her title. Later that afternoon, as villagers gathered beside the river to welcome travelers passing through, the distant sound of great wings once again echoed across the sky. Everyone looked upward as the magnificent dragons of the Dragon Empire appeared high above the valley. This time they did not continue west. Instead, the royal procession slowly descended into the open meadow beyond the village. The Dragon Emperor stepped forward with the same quiet dignity that had commanded respect inside every royal court. Claire looked at him with surprise before offering a warm smile that carried neither fear nor formality. The Emperor returned her smile with unmistakable affection and gently placed one hand over his heart. "It is time to come home," he said. Claire looked around at the villagers who had welcomed her without question, then toward the peaceful fields where she had begun discovering herself again. She realized that home was no longer defined by walls, crowns, or ceremonies. Home was wherever she could live with honesty, kindness, and purpose. She thanked every family individually before embracing the elderly teacher and the baker who had treated her like one of their own. As she stepped toward the waiting procession, the villagers applauded not because they were saying farewell to a queen, but because they were honoring a woman whose goodness had quietly changed every life she touched. High above the valley, the dragons lifted gracefully into the bright blue sky, while sunlight reflected across their magnificent wings. Claire looked down one final time at the smiling faces below before turning toward the horizon with peaceful confidence. Far behind her, the Northern Wolf Kingdom continued beneath a king who had finally learned that true greatness could never be measured by power alone, while ahead lay a future where Claire no longer needed anyone's approval to understand her own worth. Some stories end with a crown restored, others with a throne reclaimed, but this one ended with something far more lasting: the quiet triumph of a heart that remained kind after disappointment, the wisdom of a ruler who learned too late what could not be replaced, and the enduring truth that genuine strength is never proven by the authority we possess, but by the compassion we choose to give when no one is watching.